PhD student Nicole Verzi flew in from California to see her friend's newborn twin boys earlier this summer. Now, the district attorney is seeking the death penalty for her after investigators say she one of the twins, 6-week-old Leon Katz.
It was something that I hoped wouldn't be sought, but I expected that was a possibility.
A woman who was babysitting her friend's infant twins has been charged with boys and injuring the other. It happened this weekend in Shadyside.
And now she's in the Allegheny County Jail.
He was still breathing when the call came in that night in June 2024 in Pittsburgh, and at first it sounded like something that could still be explained, something that could still be fixed if help came quickly enough. The baby was just 6 weeks old. His name was Leon Katz, and the woman on the phone said he had a bump on his head and wasn't responding the way he should, but she insisted it was an accident, that he had simply fallen. But within hours, Leon... That woman was Nicole Verzi, a PhD student in clinical psychology who had been visiting from San Diego. And almost immediately, doctors began to question the story they had been given because what they saw didn't match a fall, not in severity, not in pattern, not in any way that made sense. And as investigators started to look closer, they realized there was something else that made the situation even more troubling. Leon hadn't been the only baby in that house that night. He had a twin brother. And that second baby had also been hurt earlier that same day, while under the care of the same person. 2 infants, 1 home, 1 caregiver. And by the end of that night, one of them didn't survive. And when Nicole Verzi spoke again and moved past that first explanation, what she said next would completely change the direction of the case. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. This video is created solely for educational and documentary purposes. It does not endorse, glorify, or condone any of the criminal actions or individuals described in this case. Viewer discretion is advised. It was June 2024 in Pittsburgh, and for Ethan Katz and Savannah Roberts, life had just shifted into something completely new, because only a few weeks earlier, in early May, they had welcomed twin boys into the world. And at just 6 weeks old, everything in their home now revolved around those 2 babies. Every day followed a rhythm that was both exhausting and deeply meaningful because it was built around feeding schedules, diaper changes, short stretches of sleep, and those unpredictable moments when both babies needed attention at the same time. And yet, in between all of that, there were small, quiet moments that made it all feel worth it, the kind of moments new parents hold on to, even when they're running on very little rest. And for Ethan, there was something else approaching that made this time even more significant, because this would be his first Father's Day with his sons. And in the middle of all of that, they weren't alone. Nicole Verzi had come to visit. And she wasn't just someone passing through or someone they barely knew. She was a longtime friend, someone Savannah trusted, someone who had been part of their lives long before the twins were born. And when she arrived from California, she stepped into their routine in a way that felt natural. She was a PhD student in clinical psychology, and her work focused on things like trauma, stress, and human behavior. So on paper, she understood vulnerability in a way most people didn't, and she had spent years studying how people respond under pressure, how emotions shape actions, and how fragile situations can affect the mind. And in that environment, with 2 newborns and 2 tired parents trying to keep everything together, she stepped in to help, and she did the things you would expect someone in that position to do. She helped with feeding, she handled diaper changes, she held the babies when they needed to be soothed, and she stayed close enough to be useful without feeling like an interruption. And that's what made everything that followed so hard to process later, because when people looked back, they couldn't point to a moment where something clearly went off track. However, on June 15, 2024, earlier that day, Nicole noticed something during a diaper change. And at first, it wasn't presented as an emergency, just something that didn't look right, something that needed to be checked. So she took a closer look and realized there was blood in the diaper. It was airy, and when she checked again, the concern grew, because there was visible swelling, there was redness, and it wasn't something that could be explained away as irritation or something minor. So instead of waiting, she did what most people would do in that moment. She took a picture and sent it directly to Ethan, and that message became the first point where the day started to shift. Then more details came into focus. There were small scratches on Ari's face, marks that hadn't been there before, and there were areas on his body that showed signs of and there was also injury in the area. And when you put all of that together, it didn't feel like a single issue anymore. It felt like something that needed to be addressed quickly, even if they didn't yet know what had caused it. So they made a decision. They chose to take Ari to the hospital to have him properly examined, because at that point, and in that moment, with their focus entirely on Ari, they moved quickly, they gathered what they needed, and they left the house with him. But in doing that, they made a decision that seemed reasonable at the time, and one that was based entirely on trust, because they left their other son behind. Leon. He was still at home. And the only person with him was Nicole. After Ethan and Savannah left with Ari around 6:30 p.m., the timeline inside the house became much harder to trace, because there were no other witnesses, and everything that followed depended almost entirely on what she later said happened during that window of time. Nicole said she continued caring for Leon the way she had been doing earlier, that she fed him, changed his diaper, and burped him. Then, according to her, she stepped away. She said she moved into the kitchen, not far, just enough distance to be out of the immediate space, and for a brief moment, everything was quiet. But then she heard something that broke that silence, and she described it as a cry that was different from before, sharper, more sudden, something that immediately drew her attention. So she went back. And when she returned, she said she found Leon on the floor, on his left side, and there was already a visible swelling on his head, something that hadn't been there before, something that made it clear that whatever had happened had just happened. That was the version she gave, that he had fallen from a seat, that he hadn't been strapped in, and somehow, during that short moment when she was away, he ended up on the floor, and that explanation became the foundation of everything she said in those early hours. Then, Nicole reached for her phone, and the first person she called was Ethan, because in that moment, he was already at the hospital with Ari. So she told him something was wrong with Leon, and the way she explained it still followed the same story, that he had fallen, that he had hit his head, and that he wasn't responding the way he should. And while that call was happening, the situation was already shifting, because whatever had just occurred wasn't stabilizing, it was getting worse. So after speaking with Ethan, she placed another call, this time to 911, and that call came in at around 11:17 p.m., marking the first official record of what was unfolding inside that house. At the beginning of that call, Leon was still breathing, and there was still some level of responsiveness, so it sounded like there was still time, still a chance that whatever had happened could be managed if help arrived quickly enough. But as the call continued, and as those minutes passed, his condition began to change. And while emergency services were already on their way, Ethan was moving at the same time, because as soon as he understood what he was being told, he left the hospital and headed back home, trying to close the distance as quickly as possible. And those two movements happened almost in parallel, first responders moving toward the house, and a father trying to get back to his child. And by the time help arrived, it was clear that this was no longer a minor situation, because something was seriously wrong, and the condition Leon was in didn't match the simple explanation that had been given. At the hospital, everything moved quickly, because the moment Leon arrived, the medical team shifted into emergency mode, and there wasn't time for assumptions or explanations. There was only time to assess what was in front of them, so they began running scans and checking for any signs that could explain his condition. And as those results started coming in, the picture became clearer, but not in the way anyone had hoped, because what they were seeing didn't align with the story that had been given. And it didn't match what you would expect from a simple fall from a seat, not in severity, not in pattern, and not in the way the injuries presented themselves. There was a serious head injury, and it wasn't isolated. It affected multiple areas. And the more they looked at it, the harder it became to connect those findings to the explanation that had been offered earlier, because those kinds of injuries don't come from a short drop. They don't happen in a single brief moment. And they don't leave behind that kind of impact without something more forceful behind it. So while the team continued working, trying to stabilize him and do everything they could in that moment, the reality of the situation was already beginning to settle in, because the condition he was in was critical and it wasn't improving. Leon didn't make it. He was pronounced dead in the early hours of the morning, around 5:47 a.m., and the timing made it even harder to process because it was Father's Day, and instead of marking that moment as the beginning of something new, it became the point where everything broke apart for that family. But even as that loss became real, the focus didn't end there, because doctors were still looking at Ari, the twin who had been brought in earlier that same day, and as they examined him more closely, they began to recognize something that connected both cases, something that shifted the entire situation from a single, unexplained event into something much more serious. So, the next step was to determine exactly what had caused his death, not based on what anyone said, but based on what his body showed. So an autopsy was performed, and the findings were direct. The cause of identified as blunt force trauma to the meaning the injury was the result of significant physical impact, not something minor, and not something that would typically come from a short fall inside a home. Doctors also noted that the injuries involved more than a single point of contact, which suggested that this wasn't a brief, one-time event that happened in a split second, and it didn't align with the kind of accident that had been described earlier. And based on those findings, the manner of death was officially ruled a homicide. At that point, the question was no longer whether Leon had simply fallen. The question was what actually caused that level of injury, and who was responsible for it. The next morning on June 16, 2024, after everything that had happened overnight, Nicole agreed to go with detectives and speak to them. And it wasn't a forced situation. She wasn't taken in under pressure. She walked in on her own. And at that point, the conversation started in a controlled and measured way, because the goal was to understand what had happened during those hours inside the house. At first, she held back. She said, "I think I should stay silent." And for a moment, it seemed like that would be the direction she took, but then she kept talking, and once she started, she returned to the same explanation she had already given, the same sequence of events, the baby in the seat, the short moment in the kitchen, the sound of crying, and the discovery on the floor. She repeated it, and she stayed with it, and she didn't immediately move away from that version of events. But detectives didn't accept it as it was. They began to walk through the details with her, step by step, and they focused on the parts that didn't align, the nature of the injuries, the timing of what had happened, and the differences between what she described and what had already been observed medically. And as those points were brought, then at one point, she asked for a lawyer, and when she did, the questioning stopped, because that's how the process works, and from that moment there were no more direct questions being asked, but she remained there, in the room, and time continued to pass. Hours went by. She spoke with her parents, and she also spoke with her lawyer, going over what had already been said and what would come next. And then, after those hours had passed, she made a decision. She asked to speak again, and that moment was the turning point. So she looked at them, and she said, "I'm going to tell you the truth." And from that moment, everything that had been built around the idea of a fall began to crack, because she no longer stayed with that version of events, and she didn't try to defend it. She said it wasn't a fall, and that it didn't happen just once. And as she spoke, she acknowledged that what she had said earlier wasn't the full truth, and she said, "I can't keep lying." And from there, the legal process moved forward. Nicole Verzi was formally charged with criminal homicide along with multiple counts of aggravated assault and child and those charges were tied not only to the death of Leon Katz, but also to the injuries sustained by his twin brother earlier that same day, which prosecutors treated as part of the same chain of events. She was taken into custody and held without bond, meaning she remained in jail while the case moved forward, and as the process continued, one of the most critical legal battles centered around her statement to police because the defense argued that it should not be allowed in court, claiming it was obtained under pressure during a long interrogation and should therefore be excluded. That issue went before the court, and after reviewing how the interrogation was conducted, including the fact that she had been advised of her rights, had access to a lawyer, and later chose to speak again on her own, the judge ruled that the statement was admissible, meaning it could be presented as evidence during trial. That decision became a major turning point in the legal process because it meant that what she said in that room would not be set aside, it would be examined directly in court, and it would play a central role in how the case is argued moving forward.
PhD student Nicole Verzi flew in from California to see her friend's newborn twin boys earlier this summer. Now, the district attorney is seeking the death penalty for her after investigators say she killed one of the twins, 6-week-old Leon Katz.
It was something that I hoped wouldn't be sought, but I expected that was a possibility.
David Schrager is Verzi's defense attorney and says she maintains her innocence. He called her family to tell them about the DA's decision.
Prepared them for this possibility, and we discussed the potential outcomes, and they are 100% supportive of their daughter. They love their daughter. They're doing everything they can to support her.
According to detectives, Verzi also hurt Leon's twin brother. And while the parents took that baby to the hospital, that's when police say she killed Leon. As we've reported on prior death penalty cases in the past, former Governor Tom Wolf issued a moratorium on the death penalty years ago, and Governor Josh Shapiro has agreed to uphold it.
Whether or not there's a moratorium is a political decision. And the DA probably has to make their decisions based on the family and the law and leave the politics to the politicians.
We asked the DA's office why he's adding another death penalty to the county's list if it may never happen. A spokesperson told us it was made after careful and serious consideration. She added that they aren't making a political statement nor playing games. It's undertaken seriously in consideration of the law.
At the same time, prosecutors made it clear that they were pursuing the most serious penalty available under the law, and that decision was based on factors such as the age of the victim and the nature of the alleged actions, which they argue meet the threshold for that level of prosecution. The defense, however, has continued to challenge the case from multiple angles, maintaining that what happened should be viewed differently from how it has been presented, and focusing both on disputing intent and on questioning the reliability and interpretation of the evidence, including the statement itself. So as it stands now, the case has not reached a final outcome, and it is still moving through the court system where both sides are preparing to present their arguments in full, and where the events of that night, along with everything that followed, will be examined in detail before a final decision is made.
With the details.
Nicole Verzi is behind bars here, charged with homicide after police say 6-week-old Leon Katz died while in her care.
Unimaginable, huh? Just terrible, and I feel so sorry for the family.
It's an unimaginable crime, yet police say it happened in this Shadyside neighborhood. 6-week-old twin boys, one killed, the other injured, at the hands of their babysitter.
They're so innocent, they didn't ask for this, and helpless. You just don't understand, why someone would have this in their heart. Terrible feelings. What would precipitate something like this? Cannot imagine.
Police were called to this apartment building on Walnut Street Saturday night for a report that a baby had fallen from a bouncer. The 911 caller was identified as 29-year-old Nicole Verzi, a friend of the baby's parents who was visiting from San Diego. She told investigators 6-week-old Leon Katz fell from the bouncer when she left the room to get him a bottle. Katz was rushed to UPMC Children's Hospital, where he later died from blunt force trauma to the head that caused a skull fracture. Doctors who treated Katz said his injuries were not accidental. Verzi's attorney, David Schrager, disagrees.
Our client was thrust quickly into a role of having to babysit a small child, and an accident occurred and that child died. And unfortunately, accidents do happen, and it's a sad thing, it's an awful thing, but it doesn't mean that someone's culpable.
According to the criminal complaint, the reason Verzi was watching Leon Katz Saturday night was because his parents had to rush his twin brother to the hospital for an injury to his genital area after being in Verzi's care earlier that day. Katz's twin brother was found to have scratches, bruising, and swelling.
I would ask the public to always listen to the facts and not jump to conclusions and allow the facts to come out as appropriate.
In the end, what makes this case difficult to process isn't just what happened. It's who was trusted when it happened. Because Nicole Verzi wasn't a stranger who forced her way into that home. She was someone they knew, someone they had welcomed in, someone they believed would help protect their children. And that kind of trust is not casual. It's built over time, and it's given with the expectation that it will be honored. And that's what makes the outcome harder to accept, because the same person who was trusted to care for those babies became the only one present when everything went wrong. And that shift from trust to doubt is where the weight of this story really sits. There's also something else that stands out, something that people keep coming back to, because Nicole wasn't just anyone. She was a PhD student in clinical psychology, someone who had spent years studying human behavior, understanding vulnerability, and learning how people respond to stress and trauma. And on the surface, that kind of academic background carries a certain expectation that knowledge in that field should come with a level of awareness, restraint, and empathy. But this case challenges that assumption, Because academic achievement, no matter how advanced, doesn't automatically translate into emotional intelligence, and it doesn't guarantee compassion, and it doesn't prevent someone from acting in ways that contradict everything they appear to represent. And that disconnect is part of what makes this situation so difficult to reconcile. And then there is the family. Because for Ethan and Savannah, this didn't end with the investigation and it didn't end with the charges. It became something they carry forward, something that reshapes how they mark time, because June 16th will never just be another day and Father's Day will never be what it was supposed to be. It was meant to be a beginning. Instead, it became a reminder of the child they lost and the moment everything changed. And for Ari, the one who survived, life continues, but it continues differently. Because he will grow up knowing he had a twin, knowing that there was someone who was supposed to grow alongside him, share those early milestones, and move through life at the same pace. But that didn't happen. And that absence will always be part of his story. 2 children were in that house that night. Only one would leave it to grow up. And everything that followed started with trust. And that brings us to the end of this case. What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. If this story shook you, there's more on the channel that dives into cases just as haunting. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, and share this video. It helps keep these stories from being forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.